For the mortise and tenon joint, I'll start with clamping cawls to ensure that the tabletop end where the breadboard will join is flat. Next, you can see here that I've marked where the breadboard end joint will be and also where the width of the tenon is. And then I've marked where the edge of the router faceplate will be for the bit to cut the tenon and where I'll clamp a straight edge. I'm intentionally leaving the tabletop edge long so that the router face will be supported on both sides for the cut. Next, I'll mark the other edge of the tenon and add a second straight edge. I have these aluminum straight edges, but you can also use a strip of plywood or MDF. I'll clamp these in place and then begin routing the top side of the tenon in multiple passes, cutting about 1/8 inch of material at a time. I measured the thickness of the boards with a caliper and did the math in order to leave a 1/2 inch tenon after cutting on both sides of the table. I'm using a handheld router for this, and that's so handy, and it's become one of my favorite tools because it's so lightweight and easy to handle. At the time of this video, you can find these for around $100 to $150, and I think it's a worthwhile investment because there's so many uses for it. Go slow and take multiple measurements so that you don't end up removing too much material. Then flip the table over and carefully transfer your measurements to the bottom side of the table and repeat the process to make the cuts. Use a circular saw to remove the waste edge of the tenon. And once you've got the tenon cut, we're ready to mortise the breadboard edge. I'll measure out the mortise on the edge of the breadboard so that it's exactly in the center and mark the joint. I'll clamp the breadboard to the table and use a 1/2 inch drill bit marked with tape to the appropriate depth. Then I'll use a drill block to line up the cut and remove material from the end of the mortise joint. This is to make it easier to remove material left from the curvature of the table saw dado blade. Using painter's tape, I'm marking the edges of the mortise joint on the breadboard so that I can line them up on the table saw. We'll be cutting the edges off the tenon with a coping saw so that the joint is hidden. You can see where I've marked the in and out points of the dado blade on the table saw with painter's tape. I've measured the fence so that the blade is precisely lined up to cut the mortise joint in the exact center of the breadboard edge, and I'll begin making multiple passes with the dado blade. I'll make multiple cuts, gradually raising the dado blade height about 1/4 inch each time until the cuts are just slightly over 1 3/4 inch, which is the length of the tenon. I'll take a final measurement of the depth of the mortise joint and raise my blade just a bit for the final pass of this cut. Here's the final cut mortise on the breadboard end. Using a chisel and a drill, I'll clean out the material at each end of the mortise joint. Note that I previously used a coping saw to remove about 1.5 inches of the tenon from each edge, which I forgot to film, so that the joint will be hidden. I'll use 3 dowels on each end. The middle one will be glued in place for a permanent joint, but the edge dowels will only be glued at the top and bottom of the mortise, but without touching the tenon, and this will allow for movement in the tabletop. Using a 3/8 inch drill bit, I'll drill 3 dowel holes 1 inch from the edge. You'll want to use a drill block or a guide to make sure you're drilling the dowel holes at a 90-degree angle. Next, I'll remove the breadboard so I can elongate the 2 edge dowel holes. I'll mark the edge holes so that they are vertically elongated but not horizontally. Using a coping saw, I'll carefully cut out my markings so that when attached with dowels, they allow side-to-side movement but won't pull away from the table ends. Now I'll reattach the breadboard, lining up my markings so that the center hole aligns perfectly. You can buy ready-made 3/8 inch dowels, or you can buy a dowel rod and cut them to size. With the breadboard end on, I can remove the cawls. Here I'm gluing the middle dowel joint to permanently secure it. I'm not worried about gluing the dowel to the tenon since it's only at one point. The edges, however, are a different story. Here I'm using a craft brush to dab some glue in the rim of the bottom mortise hole, being careful not to let glue touch the tenon. Then I'll insert a dowel until I can just feel it on the bottom, and then I'll add a small amount of glue to the top of the dowel before further inserting it so that the glue will fix the dowel to the top and bottom mortise holes, but the tenon will be dry and allow for movement. Lastly, I'm using a flush cut saw, or you can use a chisel or even a sander to remove the excess dowel material, and then the tabletop will be ready for finishing.